Chapter 39 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. It was Stephen Gore who had ridden that steaming horse into the courtyard of Thorn. Stephen Gore, with jaded, twitching face, and eyes that looked weary with straining and gazing into the deeps of the night. No man can be constantly and statuesquely selfish through life. The very whims and impulses of human nature are against such a frozen constancy in self-seeking. Nor can a man ever swear to being master either of himself or of his future. The whole gamut of the emotions are arrayed against him. A child may prove his vanquisher, or a woman his seducer. Stephen Gore exchanging epigrams with some princely wit, or bending over a pretty woman's chair, was a different creature from Stephen Gore, shabby, saddle-sore, jaded to death, riding with an imagined price upon his head and a prophetic mist of blood before his eyes. Throw a man out of his natural environment, and he may lose all the genius of self, and even the poise of manhood. Milton, seated upon a boat's thwart, in the midst of mad, cursing Jamaica buccaneers, would have probably seemed contemptible and a coward. March out of fop in vile clothes, and he may prove a sneaking, cringing, self-shamed thing, for all his soul was in his coat. We are so much the creatures of habit that our habits flatter us like well-trained and obsequious servants, and we lose our dignity, and even ourselves, without their ministrations. So it had proved with my Lord of Gore that November night, after a reckless, memory-haunted ride from something he feared toward something that he was being taught to fear by the bleak, wind-swept loneliness of wild roads in night and in winter. Nature is powerful to work upon a man's mind when all the primal instincts of hunter or hunted come again to the surface. All the damned out of hell might have been rushing on him through those gibbering, moaning woods. The very trees had grotesque and sinuous hands stretched out to catch and strangle. There had been the physical weariness of it all, the chafing of the saddle, the stiffness, the lust for speed, the flounderings of a tired horse, the 101 vexations that break the heart in a man when it has no inspiration to keep it whole. And as the poise and the self-grip of the colder will had slackened, so the emotions had taken law of license and had scrambled abroad over the man's consciousness. The cool, eclectic, cynical, civilized gentleman gave place to the credulous, elemental, emotional savage. Primitive instincts came to the surface, an awe of death and the invisible, a dread of the dark. My Lord Gore's nerves were as tremulous as the nerves of a coddled boy when he reined in his steaming horse under the shadow of Thorn Tower. His face looked flaccid, and yet under strain. He had lost that power and precision of movement that is second nature to a man bred among pomps. He nearly fell as he climbed out of the saddle, looking about him with quick, scared glances, such as a child might have given in a dark garden at night. The dog seemed alive enough, and sufficiently lusty to scare away ghosts, but my lord cursed him for the infernal pother he made, being out of heart and therefore out of temper. He led his horse toward the kitchen entry, where the light of the fire came out, and stood there waiting in the throat of the short passage, as though expecting some one to come out to him and at least be decently servile. But since no living soul appeared to answer the barking of the dog and the clatter of hoofs on the stones, he hitched the bridle over a hook in the wall and marched in slowly, yet with the slight swagger of a man who has no reason to be proud of his courage, and yet is determined not to be put out of countenance by anything he may see or hear. But there was nothing tangibly alive in Thorn that night, save the dog in the yard, nothing but the crusts and embers of life, and the silence amid the rush of the wind that made the place seem cold and ominous. A man's nerve may come back to him again when he has got a grip upon realities, but surmises and conjectures at midnight are apt to run toward emotionalism and panic. There were the blazing fire, the remnants of a meal upon the table, the whining of the hungry dog, to prompt him to a conclusion. But my Lord of Gore began to shiver inwardly, and to become conscious of an empty feeling under the heart, and of a vague horror that seemed to penetrate the air. Yet a lust to see the end of it, and a blind impatience that set aside shadows and suspicions, gave him sufficient animal courage to light the lantern his son had left, and to go exploring through the ruins. The ways of Thorn seemed known to him, for he went first to the tower, nor did he need to go beyond the first few steps in order to discover the ooze of a tragedy staining the stones. None the less he went on doggedly, as though carried upward by the very ferment of the passions in him, greatly dismayed within himself, yet greatly afraid of missing the whole truth. And so the lantern went jerking upward into the darkness of the tower, its movements seeming to signal some restless, devil-driven quest after unhallowed spoil. When Stephen Gore came back again into the blaze and warmth of the kitchen, he looked shrunken and ashy about the mouth, and he walked in a stooping, hollow-chested way, like a man huddling into himself because of the cold. He closed both doors, and even the doors of the cupboards, after peering into them, as though he were afraid of the dark and of any dim, unlit corner. Then he drew the couch up close to the fire, spreading his hands to it, and staring at the flames with a vacant, colourless face. The horror of some unseen thing seemed in his eyes, and his lips fell apart and loosened like the lips of a very old and feeble man. At midnight there had been a moon, but before dawn snow came, a great, grey, shimmering gloom drifting through the vague world. The dry leaves shivered and crackled in the wind as the myriad flakes came sweeping down, ribbing the boughs and the curved fronds of the bracken, piling itself amid the moss at the roots of great trees, and scudding over the open lands with a fierce, withering haste that left the grass tussocks white like stones catching foam from a rushing stream. The dawn came as a mere greyness, with a flocculent, drifting chaos of snow in the air, and a bite in the north-west wind that sent spikelets of ice bearding the fringes of ponds and ditches. Now Mrs. Winnie had been awake most of the night, and had risen very early, full of an instinct that strange things were about to happen, what with such a storm of snow the first week in November. She had the fire lit in the kitchen and was standing at the window watching the snow come down, when she heard a horse neigh in the stable, as though the beast had caught the sound of a comrade's coming. And, sure enough, through the maze of snow she saw something dark draw up toward the gate, and knew in her heart that John Gore had returned. Going to the door, she lifted the bar, and saw the snow come whirling in with a hungry wind that went deep into her bosom. There was the click of the gate, and the man came up the path between the drooping stocks and the withered, swaying rose-bushes, with something wrapped in a cloak lying in his arms. Mrs. Winnie went out to meet him, her woman's nature caught by the spell of such a love-tale. "Mrs. Winnie!" "Thank God, sir, you have brought her back." The breast of his coat was white with snow, for he had wrapped both the cloaks about Barbara to keep her warm, and he looked down anxiously at the face that lay against his shoulder, as though he feared that the cold had gone to her heart. "We lost our way, and only luck helped us back again. A warm fire, Mrs. Winnie. She is half frozen." Christopher Jennifer's wife had taken a sly peep at this desired one, but she was as brisk and concerned as John Gore was, and not a woman to talk and dally. "Come in, sir, out of this wind. It bites into the blood of the child. Such a storm, with autumn only half out of the door. Let me have her, sir. I know what the cold be on these Sussex hills." John Gore carried Barbara into the kitchen, for he had ridden with her in his arms to keep her warm, guiding his nag with a touch of the knee. She had fallen asleep with weariness and the cold, a dazed, numb sleep that was not pleasant to consider. Her lips were white and her hands like ice, so that she looked more like a sleeping snow-maiden than a living girl. Mrs. Winnie had shut the snow and the wind out, drawn her man's chair forward, and was running and rummaging for pillows, wraps, and blankets. Son William put his head in, and was sent packing with the flick of a flannel across his cheek, much amazed and not a little delighted. Mrs. Winnie well-nigh took Barbara out of John Gore's arms, as though this was a woman's affair, and not a matter for a man to meddle with. The wood fire had roared up to a great red mound, and was flinging out such a heat that the very air seemed a simmer. Mrs. Winnie had Barbara propped up before it, with her head on a pillow and her bosom open to the fire. "You will find a brick, sir, holding the pantry door open. Put it in the fire to heat." John Gore did as she bade him, while she reached for the chain with an iron crook and slung the kettle on it. "There be the tongs, sir. I'll wrap the thing in a bit of flannel and put it to the child's feet. Poor dear young thing. Lady, I mean, sir. Mercy o' me, her shoes are wet and almost froze." She knelt down and stripped off the shoes and stockings, and began chafing the little feet, admiring them in her blunt, frank way, and calling them the feet of a lady of quality. She had noticed the marks on Barbara's neck, and John Gore, seeing her eyes fixed there, nodded grimly and put a hand to his throat. His eyes held Mrs. Winnie's, and she understood the need for silence. "Where be that brick, sir?" John Gore brought it out with the tongs, and Chris Jennifer's wife patted it into a piece of flannel and set Barbara's feet upon it with a smile of satisfaction. "Now for some hot toddy, sir," and she went away to mix it. John Gore bent over Barbara and touched her cheek, for a faint colour was creeping back, and he felt that even Mrs. Winnie might be kissed at such a moment. But being a quiet man, he went out to see to his horse, hardly noticing that his own feet were still like frozen clay, and his arms were stiff from carrying his love. There was a brave breakfast cooking, and the fire was a red, shimmering slope of wood ash, when Mr. Jennifer came stumping down the stairs to pause and stare in astonishment at Barbara as he opened the stairway door. She was lying back in the chair with her eyes open, but with no real soul in them as yet, her hands hanging over the chair rail, her black hair bathing her face. Mr. Jennifer came in softly and discreetly, and stood about 3 yards from her, fingering the side seam of his breeches. Then he made a bob and waited, and then a second bob, with a stolid persistent desire to be proper in the matter of politeness. But though Barbara hardly had sight or hearing for anything as yet, Mr. Jennifer stood stolidly to his convictions, and scraped his feet to make the lady look at him. Mrs. Winnie caught him at his bobbing and scraping, with a puzzled stare in his eyes, and his thick head full of kindness. He glanced at his wife with extreme cunning, and gave her a whisper behind his hands. "Come here, Winnie. What be t' lady staring at? Here I be making a knee to her." "Get out with you, you great fool!" She gave him a cuff across the ear, but Mr. Jennifer still gazed at Barbara. "She be purty enough, but what be a terrifying me be why she won't blink them eyes o' hers." "Get along with you, Chris Jennifer, you great booby! Can't you see she be dazed with the cold? And will she be thanking you for standing there and staring like a cow? Go and help the gentleman with his horse." "And did them come all on one horse, me dear?" Mrs. Winnie looked at him, and Mr. Jennifer went. Chapter 40 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 40. With the coming of winter there had been strange happenings at the Purcells' house in Pall Mall, for my lady had died the night after Stephen Gore's going, with no one to comfort her but Mrs. Jael. The servants had all fled, and the house stood deserted save for the live woman and the dead one. The very tradesmen shirked the steps, friends had business elsewhere, and Dr. Hemstruther himself, being a keen Protestant when popery was especially perilous, kept his distance, knowing that my Lord Gore's influence had been paramount there in heart and body, for my Lord Gore was one of the Catholic gentlemen upon whom the plotmen longed to lay their hands. It happened that when poor Anne Purcell died, that there was some store of silver and of plate in the house, also her jewels and trinkets, and sundry precious things that belonged to the Purcell family. Mrs. Jael showed some little care for the corpse, by covering it with a clean sheet, but she showed far more care for her own concerns, and for the valuables that were at her mercy. She ransacked the whole house, gathering every small thing of value into a heap on the floor of one of the attics, gloating and smiling over it, and promising herself great joys, for Mrs. Jael had picked up a sweetheart, a rough, sturdy fellow from Aldgate way, and she crept out one night to warn him of her good fortune, and to persuade him to help in spiriting away the plunder. The man was a common thief, and had tricked even the smooth, sly Jael for 3 months past, pretending that he was in the cloth trade, and that he hankered greatly after a comely widow. He was ready enough to join in the adventure, and cared as little for small–pox as for the reek of an open drain. And thus Mrs. Jael let him into the house by night, and they packed up the plunder between them in a couple of sacks, and so went their way into the darkness. But the man no longer had any desire for the voluptuous embraces of a widow, and in some way Mrs. Jael came to her end that night, and was found weeks later afloat in the Thames, an unrecognizable and nameless body. Now Jael, during the time that she was gathering the treasure together, had left lights burning in my lady's room to make people think that Anne Purcell was still alive. She had put new candles to burn the very night she had fled out to her death, and so an eerie thing befell, for officers in quest of papists, and my Lord Gore in particular, broke into the house, having heard the rumour of small–pox, and considered that it might be a trick. But they found Anne Purcell lying dead in her bed, a sheet covering her, and the candles burning, not a living soul in the whole house, and every chest and cupboard rifled. So the law stepped in, beat round for witnesses, and buried my lady at night with a bushel of quicklime, and extra pay to the man who buried her. Then there was a learned to-do, much hunting out of documents, and much puzzling over facts. For Mistress Barbara Purcell was her father's heiress, after her mother's death, and Mistress Barbara had come within the Chancellor's ken by reason of unsound mind, yet no living soul seemed able to tell where this same Barbara Purcell was. The lawyers looked wise over it, and sat down cheerfully to make their pickings, Chancery claiming authority in the case, and not caring greatly how long the dilemma lasted, so long as they handled the property. For every man's mind was full of the plot those months, and not for many years had the Whigs boasted so much business. Titus Oates had come toward full notoriety in October by harrowing the public with the fulminations of a furious imagination. Then had followed Sir Edmundbury Godfrey's murder, the seizing of Coleman's correspondence, and a panic in London, with mobs shouting in the streets. The Protestant beacon had been fired, and blazed with terrified fury, while Oates threw faggot after faggot to feed the flames. Catholic peers were cast into the Tower, 2,000 or more smaller people were arrested, all Papists commanded to leave London. The train-bands marched through the streets, executions were soon to begin. It was nothing but plot, 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 from Parliament to pulpit. At Thorn in Sussex, my Lord of Gore hid himself from the knowledge of all these things, a man shrunken strangely from his former buxom self, a man without nerve or energy for the moment, vacillating between plans on a dash across the Channel for France, and the timidity of a hunted thing that fears to leave its hiding-place for the open. Even as Monmouth the Protestant prince, at the head of an army, differed from Monmouth the panic-obsessed fugitive skulking in a ditch, so the Stephen Gore of Whitehall differed from the Stephen Gore of Thorn. Some blight seemed to have fallen on him, turning his manhood into a white-faced, memory-haunted thing afraid of the very shadow of its own thoughts. That brief, fierce burst of winter may have helped to chill the marrow in the courtier's bones, with the wailing of the wind and the whirling of the snow. For a man cannot do without food and fire, and Stephen Gore had to turn drudge to his own need. At first he had tried to dispense with the fire, for fear the smoke should betray him. But when he had shivered and ached for 2 days, his caution surrendered to the lust for warmth, and he brought in faggots and with great trouble made a blaze. He had found a store of salted meat, ship's biscuits, and other stuffs still left in the place, and though Thorn had a horror for him, he clung to it like a fox to his earth, knowing of no other place wherein to hide himself; for there seemed hardly a better place in the kingdom than Thorn, for Pinniger and his woman had not been molested all those weeks. There would be a score of open ways for a bold and resolute man to take later, but the heart was utterly out of Stephen Gore, and the spirit of yesterday was not the spirit of to-day. Yet what, after all, had he to fear, setting visions of judgment and other worlds aside, but the passing fury of a Protestant mob, and the wild tale of a double murder? A month ago these menaces would have stung the self in the man to thrust them aside with audacity and resolution. But a climax had come and gone. Something was breaking in him, and taking his cool self-trust away, and he felt like Samson shorn of his hair. Perhaps the bile had congealed in him with the cold, for nothing can make a man more tame and listless than a clogged and sluggish liver. Perhaps he had lost faith in his own genius for success. Perhaps he was a penitent. This last would have been the pretty, saintly end, confession and absolution, penance, the lighting of tapers and saying of masses, and all the saints in the calendar stretching out succouring hands. Yet there is something incongruous in the idea of a strong, selfish, cynical man huddling himself feverishly into the habit of religiosity when retribution comes knocking at the door. It often fails to impress the conscience. It is not always convincing, even in romance. Probably the secret of all this crumbling up of courage lay in the nature of the man's very self. Vanity may be a rare cement in the walls of a man's fortune, so long as there is no corroding acid in the air, and Stephen Gore's genius had rested upon his vanity, not in his dress alone, but in all those attributes that a man desires to see given to his splendour. His vital force had been fed upon the pleasant things of life. He was a self-inflated, artificial creature, who was strong so long as he could be flattered, but like an orthodox believer smitten to the heart with doubt, he began to find his convictions dissolving into chaos, and the adulations of self-worship becoming a mockery, despite his efforts to believe them real. Voices, sharp, sneering, sardonic voices that he had had the strength to stifle of old, began to cut him with his own cleverness, using the very gibes against him that he had used in the gay salons to his own glory. For when a cynic falls into misfortune, he is likely to discover that he has nurtured a devil that will use its claws upon the master who has reared it. Stephen Gore had often said that a man who begins to think his virtue shabby is a man who cannot afford to pay his tailor, the priest. Never confess to yourself any cause for shame, or you will soon find your feet in the mire. Men may regret, only women and fools repent. Consciousness is life, therefore a man ought to suffer himself to be conscious only of pleasant things. And my Lord of Gore was having a wider consciousness forced upon him in the narrow world of that ruined house. And where were the studied pleasantries of consciousness? A fine gentleman feeding on salt beef and onions, scraping his own fire together, and living in devout horror of a prosaic thing called death. So much so that he was possessed by a species of morsomania, grim enough to prevent him seeing the cynically comic side of his own condition. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. A man in love is not supposed to think of his lady's clothes, but only of the brightness of her eyes, and the beauty of her body, the way her lips curve when she smiles, and how she may look coy or mischievous, or sad and silent, with some mysterious desire. Yet there is a delight in practical things when shoes are for certain feet, and the petticoats to hide a certain comely pair of ankles. John Gore had inquired of Mrs. Winnie as to the shops in Battle Town, and qualified her enthusiasm somewhat to himself when she vowed that Mr. Bannister's mercery and haberdashery shop might have served the Queen. Chris Jennifer was riding into Battle that week, for the wind had backed into the south-west, and the snow had thawed in a day. And John Gore set forward to ride with Mr. Jennifer, Mrs. Winnie whispering to him that her man could carry a power of things, being accustomed to suffer all manner of commissions. For Barbara had nothing but the clothes she stood in, and was wearing a pair of Mrs. Winnie's shoes when she went down the garden path to watch John Gore mount for battle. Mrs. Jennifer was always taking her man by the coat-tails when these young things were about together. Poor Christopher had no peace in his own house, being ordered out of the way wherever he might go, and told that he was a blind booby for not keeping the corner of an eye open, and for not thrashing those lazy, gossiping rogues, his men, for loitering and hanging about the buildings. Yet Christopher took it all very patiently, going out to the stable to smoke his pipe, and teach son William to make jumping jacks, and bird-snares and pop-guns out of elder-wood. Mr. Jennifer and John Gore came to Battle Town that day, and pulled up outside Mr. Bannister's shop, where Mill Street ran toward Mountjoy and the mills. Chris Jennifer had business at the farrier's and the grocer's, so he left John Gore to his own affairs, promising to be back in half an hour in order to help load the baggage. John Gore called a boy to hold his horse, and went into Mr. Bannister's shop with the grim air of an Englishman who is tempted to feel shy. A young woman came forward with ribbons in her cap, and a saucy, giggling look that seemed to rally the gentleman on his surroundings. John Gore had no use for her at all. He looked round the shop and saw no one else but a little old woman carding wool. "Is Mr. Bannister in?" The girl stared, and the old lady put down her wool. John Gore took off his hat to her. "May I see Mr. Bannister himself, madam?" "Titsy, go and see where the master is." And Titsy went, with a flaunting fling of the shoulders, for the man had not taken off his hat to her. Mr. Bannister was a mild man in rusty brown. John Gore could see that he had just washed his hands, and bustled into his Sunday wig, for he had put it on awry. He came forward with the walk of a man who suffered from chronic rheumatism about the spine, and he was wearing at least 5 pairs of stockings, to judge by his bulgy legs. John Gore persuaded him to the end of the counter next the door, not at all pleased to see that Titsy of the ribbons had come back into the shop and was listening with both her ears. "Good day, sir. In what way may I serve you?" "I want some of these stuffs here. God knows what you call them. Stuff for gowns and petticoats and—things." The need seemed rather vague and extensive. Mr. Bannister worked his mouth about, and wondered who the stranger was, and whether he had proper money. The girl Titsy began to giggle, and John Gore half wished that he had let Mrs. Winnie come and do the shopping for him, though her taste was crude and monstrous in many ways. "The fact is, sir, I have been made the guardian of a young gentlewoman, and I find that she is not clothed in the style she should be. Come here to the door, sir, to get out of range of that confounded girl of yours, whose manners might be mended. Now, Mr. Bannister, I have heard your shop well spoken of, and I want proper stuffs for a wardrobe. You know what I mean. I leave it to you. But show me your cloths and silks and ribbons." Mr. Bannister was a man of tact, especially when a gentleman produced a purse. He turned Titsy and the old lady out of the shop, locked the door, and commenced business. John Gore was soon handling all manner of dainty stuffs, silks, brocades, cloth of red and green and blue, cottons, and the like. Mrs. Winnie had truly praised Mr. Bannister's store of treasures, and the lover soon had all that he listed for the glorifying of his lady. Gold passed across the counter. Mr. Bannister had begun piling certain dainty linen aside with the mystery of a man of sentiment. "Can I send these by carrier, sir?" "Thanks, my friend and I can take them, if you will cord the stuff so we can carry it aboard our horses." "Very good, sir, very good." Mr. Jennifer came in at that moment, his hat on the back of his head, and his face trying to kill a grin. Mr. Bannister glanced at him a little severely, and was more surprised to see the stranger own him as the friend he had referred to. "What be all these doings here, Mr. Bannister, in Battle, eh?" "What doings may you be referring to, Mr. Jennifer?" "Doings? Why, there be old Squire Oxenham out on his grey oss on t' green, with a pair of sodgering fellers in red, and half a score yeomen, and Lawyer Gibb, and a little gentleman in a great wig, with a face like a raw side of beef." Mr. Bannister had heard of none of these doings, and they went to the door, all three of them, and stood on the footway, looking toward the green. Squire Oxenham was there, sure enough, with a couple of troopers and the yeomen, all mounted, and one or two more gentlemen to watch the mounted men, who were keeping their horses moving, all save Squire Oxenham, the lawyer, and the red-faced man in the big black periwig. "What be it, Garge?" Mr. Jennifer accosted a man in a leather apron, who came swinging along the sidewalk. "Devil a bit I knows. Some of these papistry gentry to be taken, I guess. Squire Oxenham's keeping mum." Mr. Bannister pulled out a pair of tortoise-shell spectacles, and took stock of the scene. He had hardly adjusted the spectacles when the two troopers came riding up the street, followed by the yeoman, Squire Oxenham, and the rest. A rabble of small boys followed at their heels, till the squire made free with the whip he carried, and drove the boys back like a lot of dogs. They swept past Mr. Bannister's shop, Chris Jennifer running forward to hold the heads of his and John Gore's horses. They saw the cavalcade go westward past the Watch Oak, and Squire's grey horse and the redcoats of the troopers standing out vividly from the duller tints of the rest. Mr. Bannister folded up his spectacles and remarked that "the times were troubled, and that a king who gave all his days to women could not keep a kingdom clean." And he looked severely at the rows of heads protruding from the windows all down the street, and caught Miss Tits's beribboned cap bobbing back to escape his censure. "The parcels yonder are for you, Mr. Jennifer." The farmer went in to survey the bales on the counter, while John Gore passed 3 doors down the street to a cobbler who sold gentlewomen's shoes. He bought a pair of red leather slippers with silver buckles, and also some strong, stout shoes fit for the wet grasslands in winter, for it was his desire that Barbara should bide at Furze Farm till he knew how matters fared in other quarters. Christopher Jennifer was a genius at piling baggage about a horse, and they were soon on the homeward road, John Gore thinking not a little of the things he had seen in Battle Town, and wondering whither that cavalcade had ridden, and what their business might be. For when a man has a secret in his heart, he is always jealous of the vaguest threat, and ready to imagine that his secret may be meddled with by all the law and the prophets. And John Gore had no wish for the tragedy of Thorn to be dragged into the light as yet. He thought of Barbara before all else, and of any peril that might threaten her new-found health and hope. Son William was packed off to bed early that night, and Chris Jennifer went out into the wood-lodge to cut logs for the fire. In the parlour were the bales that John Gore had brought in from Battle, and Mrs. Winnie's fingers itched to open them, but Barbara knew nothing. It was after supper that John Gore took his knife and cut the cords, and, turning back the sacking, left Barbara and Mrs. Winnie to look at the things together. He left them to it, because he was the giver, and because he knew that there were some matters that he could have no hand in. He had told Mrs. Winnie what to say, for Barbara had fallen to like Mrs. Winnie very greatly, and Chris Jennifer's wife was no less fervent in her eagerness to mother the little lady. John Gore was sitting alone before the kitchen fire when the parlour door opened very softly, and a shadow fell athwart the clean red bricks. Barbara was standing there with some ruddy silken stuff held up over her bosom and falling in rich folds to her feet. He turned in his chair, smitten with the thought of how fair she looked, with her swarthy beauty and that ruddy sheen of silk to heighten it. There was just a flash of woman's vanity in her eyes that moment, a thing new in her since he had come. "Barbe!" She came to him, holding the stuff in her 2 hands, and they could hear Mrs. Winnie singing with purposeful vigour in the parlour. "John, how good of you! But you must let me—" "Let you do what, my soul?" And he rose and stood looking at her very dearly. "Pay you, John." "What pride! And nonsense! But that silk is sweet now, is it not?" She met his eyes, blushed, and looked down at her own figure, and then suddenly she let the silken stuff fall to the floor, put her two hands up over her face, and burst into tears. "How wicked of me! How utterly wicked! Why, Barbe, child? Don't speak to me, John. To think that I should give thought to such things when all this is over you—over us both." He went to her, putting an arm about her shoulder, touched her hands gently with his lips. "Weep not, dear heart. If it be wrong that you should have these pretty stuffs, it is I who am to blame for loving you." She let her hands fall and looked up through a mist of tears into his face. "John, can you ever forget the past? Can you forgive?" "What have I to forgive, dear heart?" "Ah, yes, but—" He held her at arm's length, his two hands upon her shoulders, and looked into her eyes. "Barbara, it is not your heart that is hard now. God has given this love to us, and what God gives, who shall forbid?" She hung her head and sighed. "I am wondering, John." "Well, my life? What will happen? What we must do? What the end may be?" He looked at her a moment in silence, and then spoke like a man whose strength is in his own heart. "Child, there is one good and certain thing with us. Let us hold to it, you and I together. I will take shame from no man, and no lie from any living throat. If there should be dark days, let them come. I will not let you go from me. No, for here life is, nor can there be sin or shame in that which God has given." She looked up at him quickly with a great brightness of the eyes. "John, I could not stand all alone now." "Why, my desire, what more can a man pray for?" And they still heard Mrs. Winnie singing as though she were singing at a harvest home. In a little while they went back together into the parlour hand in hand. Chris Jennifer's wife was standing with her back to them, posing herself before a little old mirror with a bright piece of stuff, pink roses upon a green ground, folded about her bosom. She turned with a start, and whisked the thing away as though shy of a piece of matronly vanity. "Why, Mrs. Winnie, you have picked out the very thing." "Me, sir? I was only trying how my little lady would look in it gathered up over the breast, just so, Mr. John." "But I bought that piece of stuff for you, Mrs. Winnie. Now come, my dear good gentleman, me with pink roses! Well, I should praise you in it. Pink roses and a face like a side of bacon. Dear soul, but it be too young for me." Barbara went to her suddenly, and taking the stuff, unfolded it and held it to Mrs. Jennifer's figure, and in truth she looked comely with the sweet colours of it, turning her coy, brusque face this way and that with self–conscious pride. "You look like a bride, Mrs. Jennifer." "Go along with you, Mr. John. You be as bad as the rest of them with your tongue." "But by my soul, dearie, it do look sweet." Chapter 42 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 42. It would almost seem that Stephen Gore was a little mad those first few days in Thorn, what with the fever of a chill he had taken in the saddle, the utter ghostliness and melancholy of the place, and the cold, raw mists that hung about the moat. The cold went to his marrow, and the sinister solitude of the house to his brain, for at night Thorn was a veritable goblin castle, where a man might imagine all manner of dim horrors. The wind made strange noises and whisperings of dismay. Plaster crumbled and fell. Slants of moonlight sprang in as the clouds drifted over the moon. The ivy rattled on the walls. Worm–eaten beams creaked and cracked, and the wind was everywhere like a haunted spirit. Stephen Gore had found only one candle left in the place. It had lasted him but one night, so that when the dusk fell he had no light but the light of the fire. And he would lie awake on the couch in the kitchen, the hot blood simmering in his brain, and a sweat of shivering fear on him, while he fancied that he heard voices in the thickness of the walls, and a sound as of things moving in the darkness. However dainty and superfine a man may be, his flesh takes command of his spirit when the smaller necessities of life fall to his own hands. It would have delighted some of the cynics of Whitehall to have seen this fine gentleman in his shirt-sleeves splitting firewood with pitiful clumsiness, and disciplining his stomach in an attempt to boil salt beef. For Stephen Gore was repeating some of the experiences of a Selkirk, save that his solitude was of his own seeking, and yet not a matter of choice. What with misery of mind and body, the malaise of the fever, and the utter melancholy of the place, my lord's manhood and his moral courage were in ruins within a week. He gave way to a sense of panic, and to a delirious lust for self-preservation that would have seemed ridiculous but for the very real torment he was in. Whether he was hunted as a conspirator against the state, or as a spiller of innocent blood, were possibilities that pointed only to the one grim issue. The morbid belief in their having sinned against the Holy Ghost has sent superstitious mortals to Bedlam. A morbid dread of death seized on my lord with equal grimness, and in a week he had lost that larger consciousness, that cool sanity and shrewd sense of humour that gave a man power over the chances of life. His intelligence began to drop to the level of the animal that seeks to cover its tracks from possible pursuers. Sagacity gave place to cunning and a blind passion for the annihilation of everything that might betray him. He sent his horse adrift, driving him out with savage prickings from the sword, so that the beast fled panic-stricken into the woods. As for the dog, he put a pistol bullet through his head, tied a weight to the carcass, and sunk it in the moat. Saddle and harness he buried in the garden, keeping the bar up across the courtyard gate, and going out from the house only at dusk. He even made his fire on the floor in the middle of the kitchen, enduring the smoke and the smarting of his eyes, so that the smoke might leak away through the doors and windows and crevices instead of pluming up out of the chimney. He burned all the rough furniture in the place, save the couch and an old stool, and taking up two of the flagstones in the floor, dug a hole under them to hide the store of food, not realizing, perhaps, that the stuff would be mouldy and rotten in a month. It was his feverish purpose to blot out every trace of life from Thorn, so that should it be raided by the law, there should be no clues. The marvel was that he found such a life worth living for the sake of the life he hoarded. But Stephen Gore was not wholly sane those days, what with the fever and the sweat of fear in him at night, and the thoughts that haunted him as thirst haunts a straggler in the desert. Nor was all this cunning of his wasted upon chimerical possibilities and feverish fancies, as the event soon proved. It was the day of John Gore's ride into Battle Town with Mr. Jennifer, and Stephen Gore had fallen asleep on the couch in the kitchen, for he could sleep in the day if not at night. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon he awoke to find that the fire had burned itself out, for the erstwhile philosopher had much to learn in the simple matter of building a wood fire so that it should not be out in an hour. He scrambled up rather sourly, and was about to cross the court to the wood lodge, when he heard a faint "Halloo!" coming from the misty stillness of the wooded slopes of the valley. Stephen Gore turned back into the kitchen like a man who has escaped walking over a cliff in the dark, and stood listening a moment, with his hand to his ear. Then he pushed the couch away toward the window, and, kneeling, swept the ashes of the fire into the hearthstone with his hands, thanking heaven for the providential perverseness of the thing in burning out while he was asleep. Climbing the lower story of the tower, he looked cautiously through the narrow window to see nearly 20 mounted men coming down over the grassland at a fast trot. My lord's knees rubbed together as he recognized the redcoats of the 2 troopers, and the more sombre and magisterial look of the gentry who followed. Days ago, Stephen Gore had searched out a hiding-place for himself, and his choice had lighted on nothing cleaner and more distinguished than the chimney in the kitchen. He had climbed up by the chain, despite the soot, he who could hardly wear the same shirt twice in a week, till the throat of the chimney narrowed so that he could use his hands and feet. About 15 feet from the ground he had discovered a little recess in the brickwork where a man might stand and not be seen by anyone looking upward. He had eased the ascent to this possible niche of refuge by knocking in an old nail or two that he had found in one of the outhouses. A great amount of majestic cant has been written about the stately courage of the gentleman. There are very few Sir Richard Grenvilles in the world, but far more Falstaffs ready to take refuge in the washing-basket at a pinch. To have played the proper heroic part, my lord should have gone out calmly to the gate of Thorn, and courteously dared these gentry to take him while he lived, or at least to have awaited them with aristocratic composure, and delivered up his arms like a great captain surrendering a fortress that he has no longer the power to hold. Such would have been the picturesque setting of the scene, but the meaner impulses of human nature triumphed, and the gentleman went up the chimney like a sweep's boy, barking his knees and elbows, and colouring his dignity with most satanic soot. Squire Oxenham and his party came to the gate of Thorn, and sent one of the yeomen over it to drop the bar and let the others in. 3 men were left to guard the horses and the gate, and 2 more to patrol the borders of the moat, while magistrate, attorney, king's rider, and the rest spread themselves abroad to ransack the place, keeping their steel and powder ready in case they might come to grips with desperate men. But for all their bravery and bustle they found nothing but silence and emptiness in Thorn, as though the place had remained lifeless since the old Scotch folk left it in the autumn. Squire Oxenham and Lawyer Gibbs found their way into the kitchen, and went no farther in the man-hunt, being content with the work done. The lawyer noticed the discoloured stones in the floor, and some wood-ash lying in the crevices, and had he touched those stones, instead of staring at them in a perfunctory and superior way, he would have discovered that they were warm, and that a fire had been lit there that very day. Squire Oxenham, being an old and plethoric man, with threatenings of gout in the right foot, sat down on the couch and pulled out a flask of Hollands. He and the lawyer began gossiping together, and the knight of the chimney could hear every word that passed. "We shall have an appetite for supper, Thomas, though we may not set eyes on Mr. Shaftesbury's lord. Deuce take me if I can get my blood hot over the notion of sending some poor devil to the block. What are you staring at the floor for, Thomas?" "There has been a fire here, squire." "Months, old man. The place where Sandy McAllister smoked his Sabbath clothes before sneaking into heaven without crossing Peter's palm. Have a drop of spirit, Thomas Gibbs. I wonder what made those Westminster wolves scent out Thorn as the man's hiding-hole. The fellow Maudsley tells me that the Purcell woman— Hello, Sacker, my man, have you found anything except owls?" "Not a thing, your worship." "Just as I thought, Mr. Gibbs, just as I thought. Any man of sense with a warrant out against him would have been in France days ago, and eating French dinners instead of freezing in a damned rubbish heap like this. But these Jacks in office must pretend to know everything. Some noodle at Westminster could be ready to tell me how much to allow my wife's sisters, and how often my cesspit ought to be emptied. Well, Mr. Maudsley, have you had enough of Thorn?" The little man in the big periwig came in looking testy, and not to be trifled with. The men trooped in after him, while the squire passed his flask round to the gentlemen, and condoled with them satirically on having drawn a blank. Stephen Gore in the chimney heard them gossiping there a while before they tramped out into the courtyard to take horse for Battletown, before dusk fell. The thunder of hoofs went over the timbers of the bridge, and slowly, almost eerily, as the water of a stagnant pool settles over the stone that has been thrown into it, the heavy silence closed again over Thorn. It was probable that my lord felt some elation over his escape, and that he was not a little eager to be out of so black and draughty a refuge. He was also very stiff and cold from having stood in that narrow recess for over an hour. At all events he began the descent clumsily and carelessly, and bearing too much weight on one of the nails that he had driven into the wall, the thing broke away from the rotten mortar, and, though he drove out his knees and elbows in an attempt to wedge himself in the chimney, his weight and bulk carried him heavily to the hearth below. Coming down on his right flank, his right thigh struck one of the iron fire-dogs about a hand's breadth below the great trochanter of the hip, and Stephen Gore felt the bone snap as a dead branch snaps across a man's knee. In the agony of it he rolled over and over till his body was stopped by the couch that Squire Oxenham had drawn forward from the window. He gripped the lower stretcher of the wood frame with both hands, and took the sleeve of his coat between his teeth, as a seaman will clinch his teeth upon a rope's end to save himself from screaming when the surgeon's hot iron sears the stump of a mangled limb. Then he lay on his back, breathing deeply and slowly, his hands tugging at the collar of his shirt as though the band were tight about his throat. His right foot had fallen outward, and when he tried to move the limb there was nothing but a spasm of the muscles and a sense of bone gritting against bone. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. The days were pleasant enough at Furze Farm, with Barbara gaining in health and colour, and in a womanly winsomeness that made even Mrs. Jennifer wonder. It was as though the real soul had come to life in her again, and her heart, that had been a thing of moods and sorrows of old, had warmed into a richer consciousness of life, so that the beautiful shell began to glow with the light of the beautiful spirit within. There was a sweet sparkle of youth in her that began to play over the surface of sadness, and though the past still shadowed her, she stood free from the utter gloom of it, and saw the golden rim of the sun. She made friends with little Will Jennifer, played hide-and-seek with the boy, and told him tales in the dusk before he went to bed. She and Mrs. Winnie, too, were busy making up the stuffs from Battle into gowns and petticoats, and though Mrs. Winnie's craft was simple and somewhat crude, the colours lighted up Barbara's comeliness, and the very simplicity of the frocks seemed in keeping with that Sussex fireside. She even besought Mrs. Winnie to let her learn the lore of the dairy, the art of butter-making, and the like, for the primitive, busy life of the place seemed good to her, and full of the warmth and fragrance of a home. John Gore took her riding with him over the winter field, for he had bought her a quiet saddle-horse in one of the market-towns. Yet though the days were magical for lover and beloved, there were the sterner issues of life to be confronted, nor could they forget those clouds that had withdrawn a little toward the horizon. Moreover, John Gore began to feel the very material need of a replenished purse, and an insight into the future that concerned him and his love, even unto the death. He laid everything before Barbara one evening as they rode homeward toward Furze Farm, with a red, wintry glow in the west, and the hills wrapped in bluish gloom. Riding very close to him, she listened to all his reasonings, accepting things that went against her heart, because she knew that he loved her, and because she felt him to be shrewd and strong. "Do that which you think best, John," she said, with an upward look into his face. "I trust you with all that life can hold." And so their nags went homeward side by side, so close that the man's arm was over the girl's shoulders, and her breathing rising up to him in the keen, clear air like a little cloud of incense. One morning early in December John Gore took the London road, following the same course that he and Mr. Pepys had taken, by Battle, Lamberhurst, Tunbridge, and Sevenoaks. Nor could he help contrasting the difference of the ways, and the different spirit that inspired him, though the woods were bare now, and the country grey and colourless where no sun shone. His thoughts went back over the Sussex hills to that farmhouse, with the broad black thatch, its beech-trees, and its uplands, its brick-paved, low-beamed kitchen, and the fire red even to the chimney's throat, and the kindly folk who moved therein. But chiefly he thought of Barbara sitting before the winter fire, her great eyes full of the light and dreams thereof, and her Spanish face betraying new depths of womanhood because of the suffering she had borne and the spirit of beauty she had won thereby. John Gore put up at an inn in Southwark, meaning to keep his distance from the precincts of St. James's, and from that intriguing, cultured, cruel world that had held his own father as a murderer and a paramour. He had heard of grim things in Spanish provinces and the islands, but nothing that had brought home to him the shame of the goddess self in passion, as this tragedy in an English home had done. He could only think of the man, his father, with pity, and a kind of revolting of the honourable manhood in him. It was almost a subject beyond the pale of thought, a thing rather to be realized, and then buried. Now John Gore was innocent of all knowledge of Oates's plot and of the wild ferment the city was in, for the news of it had not trickled as yet into the byways of Sussex, and he had kept to himself upon the road. His plan was to hunt out Samuel Pepys, and hear the news of the surface of things, whether my lord was in town, and whether the secretary would act for him in receiving and forwarding his Yorkshire moneys. His first visit across the water was to the Admiralty offices, and there, when he had sent his name in, Mr. Pepys came out in person with a mightily solemn face. He took his friend straight to a little private cabinet of his own, locked the door, and pushed John Gore ceremoniously into a chair. "Well, John, you have come here, have you, with a lighted candle to look for sixpence in a barrel of gunpowder? Where have you been all these weeks?" Mr. Pepys's manner was the manner of a man who had some reason for being honestly perturbed. "Within 10 miles of the place you left me at, Sam. I have come up for news and money." Mr. Pepys looked at him steadily, yet with a species of alarmed awe. "News, John? Gracious God! We are shaken in our shoes with fresh news every other day. You have heard of the plot, of course." "Plot? What plot?" Mr. Pepys's silent stare expressed infinite things. He stepped forward, tapped John Gore on the chest with his forefinger, then stepped back again, and made him a reverence. "Can I bow, sir, to a gentleman who has never heard of Titus Oates? Alack, John, I fear me I have many sad and solemn things to tell you. I thought that you had heard everything, and that you were wintering in the country, like a wise man, for it is not flattering at present to hear the name of Gore." He saw the sea captain straighten suddenly in his chair, and look up at him keenly. "What do you mean, Sam?" "Mean, sir? Did I not warn you that the papists were likely to burn their fingers? And we are in the thick of such fire and fright and fury because of them that we are all afraid to catechize our own souls. News, my good John! The Protestants raging, informers making Ananias seem a simpleton, Catholic peers in the Tower, hundreds in jail, Coleman the Jesuit tried and executed, a warrant out against your father, who has taken to his heels and fled." "Good God, Sam, where?" "That is what certain people would like to know, sir. I pity your innocence, John, but we are all of us shaking in our shoes. Even the Queen has not been pitied." John Gore sat forward in his chair, his hands on his knees, his eyes looking into the distance. He was silent a moment, while Mr. Pepys fidgeted with his feet and glanced nervously at both door and window. "I have not seen my—Lord Gore since I left London with you, Sam." "No? I have heard nothing of all this. What is more, I have matters of my own." Mr. Pepys stroked his chin. "There is yet another piece of news, John." "Well?" "Concerning the Purcells." The sea captain looked at him sharply. "What?" "Anne Purcell died of the smallpox a month ago." "Anne Purcell!" "Yes. It would have been the talk of the town but for this furious belcher of accusations, even the man Oates." John Gore looked at him in silence. "She was found dead in her bed in her house in Pall Mall. All the servants had fled, and the house had been rifled. But there also appears to be a mystery about the daughter. The lawyers have discovered that she was put away in the autumn for being of unsound mind, and now that all the property seems to have fallen to her, not a living soul knows what has become of her." The sea captain smiled very slightly, with a grim light in the eyes. "Who has control of the matter?" he asked. It has fallen into chancery. Like the traveller to Jericho, Sam, in the parable. How long is it since my Lord Stephen hoisted sail? Somewhere about a month ago, before I returned from Portsmouth. Did Anne Purcell die before then? Heaven help me if I know, John, but what has that to do with the case? More than you know, my friend, more than you may suspect. He had the air of a man who was troubled and perplexed by many difficulties. Sam, I want your help and advice. I can trust you. Mr. Pepys made him a little bow. Where are you staying, John? In Southwark. I had my reasons. Can you give me supper to-night and an hour's private talk? I have many things to turn over in my mind before then. The secretary laid a hand upon John Gore's shoulder. A friend's trust is a friend's affection, John. Come and sup with me. What I can do, I will. The secretary's wife was feasting with friends that night, and Mr. Pepys and John Gore had the table to themselves. When supper was over, Mr. Samuel took the sea captain to the library, locked the door, and prepared to play the part of counsellor and friend. For Mr. Pepys was a shrewd, sound man of the world, for all his oddities and love of news, a man who had walked the slippery path of public responsibility, and who knew the world's deceitfulness, even to the latest lie from the lips of a king. But even this critic of court scandals, and of the vanities of himself and of mankind at large, was flustered a little by John Gore's account of his doings, and of the tragedy that had taken place at Thorn. Mr. Pepys could pass over a gay intrigue, but this darker and more sinister affair gripped the manhood in him, and made him understand his friend's grimness. On the cross of our Lord, Sam, I pledge you to silence over this. I know you are to be trusted where questions of life and death are concerned. There was no need to question the intenseness of the secretary's sincerity. He was a man of oak, whose foibles and frivolities were merely the flutter of leaves in the wind. Have no doubt of that, John. But upon my conscience, this is black villainy, or something marvellous like it. Iago, oh Iago, thou dinest with us, and smilest at us in church. Thou art not only a thing of the stage. John Gore sat thinking, smoking his pipe, and snapping the thumb and middle finger of his right hand. It is the girl who has to be considered, Sam. She has borne enough, suffered enough, and from my own flesh and blood. That's where the rub comes. Mr. Pepys sat and considered. The Chancery folk are such a dastardly meddlesome lot, he said. I am not afraid of the lawyers, Sam. We can take our chances over the sea if needs be. But there is this man, this father, to be considered, and, by my hope in heaven, I will kill him as he killed Lionel Purcell if he meddles further with the girl's life. Mr. Pepys looked a little shocked, despite his sympathy. He had been a good son himself, and the word father had its true meaning for him. Softly, John, softly. There is always the other side of the case. We cannot always see into another man's heart. John Gore stared at the floor grimly. What I have said, Sam, I have said. Even one's father is not privileged to seduce and murder as he pleases. I shall put my sword to his breast and say, Sir, no further. He has his life in his hand. Mr. Pepys looked at him kindly. Have you not thought, John, that it may rest with the girl? With her? How? If she chooses not to speak, to play the part. John Gore met his friend's eyes. Why should this man be shielded? There is blood upon his hands. He has stained the lives of others. Who shall consider him? John, John, you talk like a man who stabs fiercely at a shadow. No man is wholly the devil's creature, and, say what you will, his loins begot you. The greater the need, Sam, to put aside false sentiment. Still, he is out of our ken at present. We must bide our time and watch. Mr. Pepys rubbed his knees with the palms of his hands. Do you know what I would have you do, John? Go back to this quiet farm. Let the child come by her health and happiness. Keep the lawyers out of it, and marry her if you can. You are echoing my thoughts, Sam. Good, very good. See what a seal, my friend, you might set upon the past, if God granted you children and happiness, and the long love of wife and man. John Gore understood his meaning. "The blood debt might be wiped away, Sam, for the sake of the future." "God grant it. And now, John, you will want money." "Money? How do you know that? John, my man, when I was in love I was always poor. I know how Dan Cupid picks a man's pocket. Besides, money is above the law, John, and at a pinch you might find it useful." "I have money enough. It needs handling, that is all. There is my property in Yorkshire." "Give me a written authority, John, and I will act for you." "Sam, you are a good friend." "I am a man of business, sir. I can receive and hand on rentals, can I not? And as for the present need, I always keep money in my house. Take what you want. The security is good enough." John Gore began to thank him, but Mr. Pepys rose up from his chair and put his two hands on his friend's shoulders. "Man, John, there may be 2 or 3 souls in the wide world whom a man may love without prejudice and without disaster. The friends of a life are few, John, and we find them without forethought. Men come to me for favors, scores of them in the year. Most of them are sycophants, rogues, hypocrites. I know it, and there is no deep pleasure in what I do. But there are some men, John, to whom the heart goes out in the game of life. To be a friend to a friend comes not so very often. A man who has seen life will swear to that." End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 44. Rain was falling and the wind beating about the chimneys of Furze Farm as the daylight waned toward a grey night, like a fog coming up from the sea. Barbara and Mrs. Jennifer were sitting before the kitchen fire, the girl watching the sparks fly upward, the woman's brown hands busy with thread and needle. Gusts of wind came down the chimney, making the wood ash shimmer at red heat, even blowing flakes of fire out onto the bricks. Now and again the drippings of the rain fell on the red mass, rousing the fire to spit like an angry cat. Chris Jennifer's wife, looking up from time to time at her little lady, could see that Barbara was listening for something beyond the mere roar of the wind in the chimney and the swish of the beech boughs in the gathering dusk. The pupils of her eyes would grow large of a sudden, and she would lift her chin and keep her bosom from breathing, as though she heard some sound far away in the coming night. Mrs. Winnie knew well what was passing in the girl's heart. Nearly a week had gone since John Gore had ridden for London, and her thoughts were out on the wet road, wondering whether he were facing the wind and rain. "I be thinking, my little lady," and Mrs. Jennifer gave a tug to the gown she was making, "I be thinking that a bunch of red ribbon would look just fair for a shoulder knot on yon scarf. My man Christopher has a liking for red in the winter, it being the colour of the berries, he says, and warm and comely when there be snow about." Barbara only woke to the sense of Mrs. Winnie's words when the good woman had come to the middle of her statement. "Is that why they wear red stockings so much in the country, Mrs. Winnie?" "Law, my dear, what a fancy! If I thought that about Christopher, I'd be taking to him with a broomstick. Red stockings for a man to stare at on market day! No, my lady, red be a warm and comfortable colour, like holly berries, and that shoulder knot would be just a touch to green." Barbara listened to the wind. "How heavy the roads must be," she said. "Honest mud never harm nobody, my dear. Lord bless you, we don't think anything of mud in Sussex." "Are the roads dangerous at night?" "And what may you mean by dangerous, my lady?" "Footpads and rough men." "London way there be them kind of creatures. Puddles and ruts be our great trouble, and the mud holes when the ways be rotten. The horse may break his leg in one of 'em. But there, God's providence be powerfuller nor mud holes." She went on with her stitching, watching a red slipper tapping a little restlessly on the brick curb about the hearth, as though beating out the furlongs and the miles. Dusk was falling rapidly, and though the fire was bright, Mrs. Winnie was thinking of lighting the candles when the red slipper ceased its tapping, and the figure before her remained motionless and alert. "I can hear a horse, Mrs. Winnie." Mrs. Jennifer listened. "It be a loose bough of the old plum-tree clapping against the wall." "I am sure it is a horse." She rose up and went to the window, and leaned her elbows on the sill. Mrs. Jennifer gave a nod of the head, as though assuring herself that youth must have its way. She knew every sound in and about the house when the wind blew from over the sea. "I will put a candle in the window, Mrs. Winnie." She went and took one from the shelf, lit it, and put it on the sill; and she was returning again toward the fire, when she paused and stood listening, her head held a little to one side. "There! Do you hear it?" Mrs. Winnie stopped her stitching and listened. This time she did hear something beyond the clapping of a bough against the wall. "Why, yes, little lady." "Listen! There is the farm gate." She turned quickly toward the door, opened it, and stood looking out into the dusk. Mrs. Winnie put her work aside, gave a glance through the window, smiled to herself, and then discovered that she had business in the dairy. In the dusk she had seen a man dismounting from a horse, and her husband plodding across the yard to welcome the traveller and take his nag to the stable. Mrs. Winnie was a woman of tact. She caught son William sneaking in by the back door, and took him with her to inspect the milk pans. Barbara stood framed in the doorway with a warm light playing about her, and the brown wainscoting, the great beams in the ceiling, and the red bricks for a background. Yet the impulse of the moment failed in her, and a shy panic took its place, so that she went and stood before the fire and turned her head away, so as not to see his coming. For there was something in the intense truth that almost made her afraid, and she might have fled away to her room but for the thought that he had seen her at the door, and might not understand the whim of a woman. She heard his footsteps on the path, and when she looked he was on the threshold, wet and travel-stained, but with eyes that were very bright. He came and took her hands, but stood a little apart because of his wet clothes, and also because there was a sense of awe between them. His eyes searched her face to see whether there were any shadows of pain or sadness thereon, and now that he was so near to her, her shyness and her confusion fled, and simple love alone had utterance. "John, how wet you are! Come to the fire and let me dry your coat. I had a feeling that you would come to-night." She led him to the fire, yet though the initiative was hers, she went with his arm about her waist. "You are looking wondrous well, Barby." "Am I?" And she coloured, and hid her eyes from him a moment. "I am glad, very glad, to have you back, John. I was afraid, with this rough weather, and the roads so bad, and you riding alone." "And yet I was not alone," he said, touching her hair reverently. "I shall never be alone again, pray God." "Yes, dear, I understand," and she put her face up for him to kiss her, her eyelids closed and the lashes shading her cheeks. Then she made him sit down in a chair before the fire, and fetching the rough towel that hung on one of the doors, she rubbed his coat while he sat patiently and tried not to look amused, for there was something infinitely quaint and sweet in this ministration to a man who had seen the wild world in its cups and in its quarrels. He caught the two hands and kissed them, and looked up into eyes that were full of a mysterious tremor of light. "Do you know, child, what you bring into my mind?" "No, John." "All the rough, blasphemous, accursed things that a man must see in this world, whether he wills it or not. They come to me, dear, as so many black memories, and I lift up these white hands, so, and I see what is clean and what is pure." She looked at him an instant, and then fell on her knees beside the chair and hid her face upon his shoulder. "John, you forget. You make me ashamed when you speak thus. We women are not angels. We are quick, selfish, passionate things, though we may be unselfish when we love." "Dear, I forget nothing of that," he said. "Do you think that I would choose to love a saint?" "I am nothing of a saint, John." "Thank God," said he. John Gore told her nothing that night of her mother's death, for the evening of that great warm kitchen seemed too goodly and dear a time to be marred by evil tidings. Perhaps self had some weight, too, with him that night, for it was a delight to watch the warm blood mantling under the soft skin, the radiance of her eyes, and the way she would look at him suddenly and colour. John Gore's eyes could not leave her that evening as they sat round the fire with Mrs. Winnie busy at her stitching, and Mr. Christopher smoking his pipe and trying to pretend that he was half asleep. The eyes of the day were empty of tears on the morrow. The world full of winter sunlight, the sky all blue, the woods all purple and grey. John Gore borrowed Mr. Jennifer's nag, for his own beast needed a rest, and saddling Barbara's horse, he took her out with him for a canter along the grass track that wound past Furze Farm and onward into the vague lands. It was a grass track that might have come down from old Celtic times, before the Romans spaced out their itineraries, a highway that had run south of the great weald that stretched from the marshes of Portus Lemanus to the plains of Gwent. John Gore waited till they were on the homeward road and not a mile from the farm before telling her of Anne Purcell's death. They were riding along the ridge of a hill, with Beachy Head, a great blue shadow far away, and the silver bow of the sea bent against the land. Barbara rode on beside him, with the light gone suddenly from her eyes, and a shocked silence making her mute. Her mother had borne and bred her, little more. She had even been ready to sacrifice the child to save her paramour and herself. And yet Barbara felt a great pity for that poor gay woman who would paint her cheeks no more, nor ogle herself in the glass to see how her eyes beckoned. Barbara's heart had changed greatly those months. She had a wider consciousness, more sympathy, more insight. It had become easier to pity than to hate. John Gore saw that she was weeping the tears of compassion and of regret rather than the tears of passion, and he let her weep, pushing his horse a little ahead of hers to give her privacy. For there are times in life when every soul must meet its intimate thoughts alone. They were within view of the farm when he heard her call to him, and her voice was very gentle, as though there were no malice and anger left in her. "Death brings things home to the heart, John," she said softly. "It is like a great silence that compels one to think." He looked at her very dearly. "My life, what can I say to you?" "Tell me, John, that I was fierce and revengeful, and it would be the truth. Who are we that we should judge? One cannot gauge another's temptations. She may have suffered, while I was blind to it." John Gore reached for her bridle, and they rode the last furlong side by side, and compassion for the dead seemed to hallow the love in their hearts. John Gore had said little concerning his father, save the news of the popish plot, and my lord's flight, with many others who were concerned. He was believed to have found refuge in France, and yet at Thorn, not 5 miles from Furze Farm, a miserable, maimed thing dragged itself to and fro like an animal that has been crushed in the jaws of a steel trap. A long splint, sandbags, and 6 weeks in bed, such should have been Stephen Gore's portion. But when a man with a broken thigh is alone in a ruin, he must either crawl or starve by inches. Destiny had hipped him, and necessity had him at her mercy. It was with labour and a sweat of anguish that he went like a worm upon his belly, for the belly hungered and tortured him with thirst, and the worm still wriggled with a blind instinct toward life. December was cold and raw at Thorn, but there was no fire, and the man lay on the stone floor with nothing under him but the cover and the padding that he had torn from the couch. There was no drink either in the kitchen of Thorn, and the quenching of his thirst became an ordeal that made his flesh quiver. Once a day a miserable, unwashen figure would go crawling across the courtyard to where the pump stood in a corner. The face of the thing that crawled resembled the face of a swimmer who feels a limb seized by the jaws of a shark. Slowly, with infinite carefulness, and a tremor of the whole body, he would prop himself against the wall, reach for the pump handle, and trickle the water into the leather bottle that he had dragged after him by a strip of linen. Then he would crawl back again, agonized, cursing the pain of those grinding splinters as the leg came over the stones, the toe catching in the grass and weeds. Sometimes the water in the bottle would last him more than one day, for he husbanded it like a miser, knowing that each drop meant the sweat of his very blood. The food was an easier matter, for he had only to drag himself to the hole in the floor, but from the cold there was no escape. It froze into heart and marrow at midnight, keeping sleep from him, even making him weep like an idiot child. What a change, too, on the surface of things! Hands grimed, nails black, a stubble of grey hair over the jowl, holes in the cloth over knees and elbows, the dirt of the courtyard upon his linen, a squalor about his bed on the stones, such as is found in foul jails. Even the lust for life, such life, would flicker out in him at times, and he would take his sword as he lay, with his broken bone galling him like hot grit in the flesh, and run his fingers along the blade, and look at it, and consider. More than once he bared his breast and set the point of the sword over his heart, feeling for a gap between the ribs, so that the steel should make no error. But the cold pricking of the point against the skin seemed to frighten even the despair and weariness in him, and he would lay the sword aside, cover his chest again, and stare at the beams in the ceiling. He had the blind lust to live, but not the blind courage to die. For even life in its most squalid misery may seem better, kinder, than the black, unfathomable unknown. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. Though all the gay stuffs, the reds and the greens and the rich brocades were put aside for a season, and though Barbara wore a plain black gown that Mrs. Winnie bought of Mr. Bannister at Battle, they made ready for Christmas at Furze Farm in country fashion, with a great abundance of food and liquor, with a Yule log the size of a tub, and holly boughs gathered out of the woods. Mrs. Winnie would have quieted the day out of courtesy to her little lady, but Barbara would have none of the pleasure spoiled because she wore a black gown for her mother. To cheat the living of their good cheer would not comfort the sleeping dead, and the very kitchen seemed warming itself for the wassail bowl, and the beef and the pies, and the women with their ribbons. Now Barbara had no money, and a great deal of pride, despite her love, so that John Gore, who knew how matters stood with her, had to resort to a lover's stratagem to fill her purse. He told her a solemn tale of how the Lord Chancellor managed the affairs of the nation, and how she was her father's heiress, though the estates were in the lawyer's hands, till the time came for her to step forward and prove herself a very comely young woman without a mad whim in her head, save that whim of loving a sailor. He also related that a very good friend of his had certain matters in hand, and was likely to receive on her behalf certain moneys that had been found in the house in Pall Mall. That money might come to her any day by private messenger. And so it did, though delivered to John Gore, and greatly to the girl's secret delight, for she knew nothing of law, and, being the lover's invention, guessed not that the money was his. Yet here John Gore well nigh landed himself in a dilemma. She began to plead that she owed him money for all the things he had bought at Battle, nor could he silence her for a long while, and then only by pretending to be a little hurt. Whereat she dropped the money as though it had burned her, and went to him and asked his pardon. The gold pieces had rolled hither and thither over the kitchen floor, and they gathered them and counted them into little piles. Barbara's eyes had begun to dance with a multitude of generous desires, and she was already planning how to spend it. "I must go a-shopping, John," she said, "for Christmas. If we could only borrow Mr. Jennifer's wagon." "A wagon, sweetheart? Do you want to empty all the shops in the town?" "No, dear, but I feel that I cannot give enough to these good people here. It has been a home, and a very dear home, John. I shall not forget it to the day of my death." Now John Gore talked privately to Mr. Jennifer, and Mr. Jennifer took counsel privately of his wife, and the result of all this talking was that Christopher prepared for a day's jaunt into the county town of Lewes. He cleaned up his wagon, put straw and bracken in the bottom thereof, tied his horse's manes with ribbons, and put out his Sabbath best. One of his men and his wife came into Furze Farm for the day, while the household went a waggoning to Lewes, starting 2 hours before dawn because the roads were heavy and the days short. Barbara, Mrs. Winnie, and son William rode in the waggon, and John Gore on his horse, while sturdy Kit marched beside his cattle, his whip over his shoulder, and a sprig of holly in his hat. Barbara had a radiant face and but little money left by noon that day in Lewes, for even if the heart has cause for sadness, there is joy in giving others joy. She seemed incarnate womanhood that Christmas-tide, taking a delight in all the little mysteries and mummeries of the season, and in all the revels that were held. John Gore had bought all manner of merchandise, a new gun for Mr. Christopher, a great family Bible for the wife, toys, sweetmeats, and oranges for son William and the labourers' children, a beautiful chain of amethysts for his love. There was much giving and receiving that Christmas-tide at Furze Farm. The 3 labourers came with their wives and youngsters to the state dinner in the kitchen. Mr. Jennifer brewed punch, got a flushed face, and talked more than he had talked for a whole year. Little Will nearly fell into the fire while roasting chestnuts. John Gore played with the Sussex children till Mrs. Winnie exclaimed at "the gentleman's good nature." Pipes were smoked in the ingle-nooks. The 3 countrywomen tried their best manners, and stared hard yet kindly at "the lady," about whom there was a mystery that had set their tongues a-clacking. Yet a woman who is sweet to other women's children wins a way into the hearts of mothers. A gracious lady, surely, they whispered to one another, and thought the better of her because she touched their children's lips. And when ribbons and blankets and good woollen stuffs came to them from her hands, they may have regretted the disobedience of Mrs. Winnie's orders as to the minding of their own business, for Mrs. Jennifer had forbidden them to gossip about the quality biding at Furze Farm. Yet gossip had gone abroad, for all Mrs. Winnie's caution, and even the lazy parson knew that there were strangers in his parish. With Christmas fare and festivity questions of the past, and St. Stephen claiming his day in the calendar, Mr. Jennifer had his cart-horses out for a gallop to sweat them well before the yearly bleeding, for it was the custom to give horses a warming and then to bleed them on St. Stephen's Day. Whether John Gore subscribed to the superstition or not, he saddled his own beast early and went out alone for a canter, having the Christmas dinner upon his conscience, and, what was more, a certain hankering to visit Thorn. For several weeks he had intended riding over to the place, but Barbara had been nearly always with him, and they had taken happier and less sinister paths. He desired to see whether there were signs of folk having been there since that November night when the horseman whom he had taken for Captain Grylls had ridden back to inquire after his lost packet. It was a still and rather misty morning, with moisture dropping from the trees, and the grass wet and boggy. The fog did not hinder him greatly, for he had learned to pick up his landmarks at every furlong, and the track was familiar and simple when once known. About 10 of the clock he came into the Valley of Thorns, and saw the dim mass of the tower glooming amidst the mist. The place seemed infinitely melancholy, with the fog about it, and the dripping thorn-trees, and the black stagnant water that showed never a ripple. The very ivy looked wet and sodden with the raw vapour of that December day. John Gore tethered his horse to one of the thorn-trees, and finding the gate open, much as he had left it, he crossed the courtyard where the mist hung in the air like breath upon a mirror. He saw that the dog was gone, but, what was more, the kennel also, and this slight detail puzzled him a little and made him more cautious in his exploring. Going to the kitchen entry and finding the door ajar, he stood there and listened. The moisture was pattering down from the ivy leaves all about the house, yet from the kitchen came a sound that could not be easily mistaken, the regular, heavy breathing of a man in a deep sleep. John Gore saw that his sword was loose in its sheath, and, pushing the door open cautiously, he passed on into the kitchen. The figure of a man lay upon the floor with nothing between him and the stones but what appeared to be a tatter of rags. A sword, a leather bottle, and 2 mouldy biscuits lay beside him, His head was thrown back and his throat showing, with the stubble of a beard making the jaw look grey and slovenly. John Gore crossed the room softly, and recognized in that ragged, haggard thing my Lord Gore, his father. It was well past noon when John Gore mounted his horse again, and rode away from the mist and shadows of Thorn, with the look of a man who had spoken, even as Dante spoke, with some soul in the deeps of hell. He was thinking of an old, yellow-faced man, maimed, dirty, servile, with clothes worn into holes, and an intelligence that had flapped between emotional contrition and paroxysms of selfish fear. This thing had been the mighty man of manners, the serene gentleman of Whitehall and St. James's, whose body had smelled of ambergris, and whose fine raiment had shamed the sheen of tropical birds. Pride, vanity, even self-honour, in the dust and dirt. A white, flaccid, furtive face that had lost all its buxom boldness, most of its intellect, almost its very reason. What had they said to each other, these two? Murderer and adulterer, lover and son. Yet John Gore had filled the leather bottle for his father that morning, lit a fire with odd wood gathered from the rotting outhouses, and brought in an armful of musty straw to soften the sick man's bed. And my lord had wept, miserable senile tears that had no dignity and no true passion. He had fawned on the man, his son, grovelled to him without shame, till the son's manhood had revolted in him, for he would have welcomed savagery and cursing rather than moral slime. It had been like a polluted river bringing all manner of drift to the lip of a weir. And though he had ministered to his father, he had kept an implacable face and a firm mouth. He had acted as a man who knew everything, and chosen to let my lord realize that he knew it, even assuming the truth that Barbara was dead. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Mad Barbara by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. John Gore rode for Furze Farm with many turbulent thoughts at work in him, and the raw mist that thickened from over the sea making the wet woods no more comforting than the degradation he had found at Thorn. He had been fierce at first with the man whom he called father, till my lord's squalid ignominy had become apparent to him, and he had realized that he was dealing with a creature and not a man, for there had been no sense of strength opposed to him, no pride, no will, not even savage passion, nothing to struggle with, nothing to overcome with shame. My lord was dead in the better sense. Those weeks in Thorn had starved and frozen the soul out of him, and he had become half a savage, yet a timid, fawning savage whose consciousness was bounded by elemental things. At first there had been nothing but abhorrence and disgust from John Gore, this cringing thing with the face of an imbecile embracing his own son's knees, lying amid his own offal. What could a man say to this shadow of a self? Where lay the promise of judgment or of appeal? Good God! He could remember the time when he had stood in some awe of this same man because of his fine presence and his habit of command. Yet as John Gore rode through the white mist the impressions and instincts of the morning began to sift themselves and to piece up a broader, saner picture. Incidents, acts, details started forward or receded into clearer, truer perspective. The offensive flavour of the thing began to prejudice him less. He tried to see the whole untarnished truth with the sincerity of a man who is not content with mere impressions. Perhaps what he saw was this: a man bred in luxury, a bon vivant, a lover of pleasure, thrown down, broken into a species of dark pit where the mere physical miseries of existence would bring him near to death in body and mind. Pain, sleeplessness, cold, hunger are grim inquisitors fit to break a man on the rack and tear the very senses from him. John Gore had looked into the hole where his father had kept his food, and had seen meat going putrid and biscuits covered with mould. He remembered, too, very vividly, an incident in the Indies when he and his ship's company had found a man who had been marooned on an island that was little better than a reef. The man was a Norman, and his sojourn there had been but a matter of days, yet he was skull-faced, parched, abject, and as mad as an idiot child. He had run from them, screaming, when they landed, though his legs had given under him before he had gone 50 yards. And he had died on board John Gore's ship, and they had buried him at sea, and often afterward, at night, the sea-captain had fancied that he still heard the man's wild cry, "J'ai soif, mon Dieu! Mon Dieu, j'ai soif!" Now Stephen Gore had been a proud man, and a man of sentiment after his own ideals. He had had other things to torture and humiliate him besides anguish in the flesh. Proportionately as a man's physical strength wanes, so the menace of spiritual suffering grows the more quick and poignant. This man had spilled blood and betrayed friends. A well-fed cynic might have put such things under his feet and trampled them. It would be otherwise with a half-starved, memory-haunted, isolated being shivering the nights through, listening and ever listening, while the solitude hung like an eternal silence, and the slightest movement of the body set bone grating against bone. Who could shrug his shoulders through such an ordeal, and come forth smiling with an epigram? Would not the very intellect curse itself and die by its own hand? Innocent blood, the betrayal of honour and of friends, lies, inevitable half-salvation, these thoughts would grip such a man, throttle him, spit at his very soul. They would not be conjured or persuaded. They would be awake with him through the winter nights, scoff when some spasm of pain made him curse and set his teeth, watch him with cold eyes when the light of the dawn came in. The same miserable dragging of the days, the same miserable passion-play of the crucified soul. Where would a man's manhood be at the end of such a chastisement? The glow of the winter fires reddened the windows of Furze Farm as the shadow of the house loomed up through the mist. The orchard hedge was dripping with dew, the grass grey and sodden, the beech trees like phantom trees, the coming of the dusk mournful and full of a heavy silence. Yet the windows of the house, with their lozenged latticing outlined by the fire, sent John Gore's thoughts back with a sudden shiver of pity to dreary, ruinous, fog-choked Thorn. He dismounted heavily, and leading his horse to the stable, left him to Mr. Jennifer, who was sitting astride a rough bench mending harness by the light of a candle. In the kitchen Barbara came out to welcome him, with just the faintest glimmer of shyness that made her love the more desirable. Mrs. Winnie was above, turning out her linen cupboard, little Will in the wood-lodge cutting firewood with the hand-bill, a thing he had been solemnly forbidden to do. Barbara and John had both kitchen and parlour to themselves. No candles had been lit in the house as yet, but the burning logs threw a rich light upon the wainscoting. "You have had a long ride, John." He hung his cloak on a chair, and took her hands, her pale face with its new ripeness of colour seeming to bring to him freshness and perfume after these abhorrent hours at Thorn. Yet his heart was stern and troubled in him because of the man, his father. Nor could even his love's eyes flash a complete smile into his. "They will be pleased with this fog at sea," he said. "I can fancy that I hear the bells ringing. What have you been doing all day, little woman?" She looked at him with questioning intentness. Rarely can a man hide care from the world, very rarely, indeed, from the eyes of the woman who loves him. "Mrs. Winnie has been teaching me to make buttonholes, John. Will and I went out after dinner, and were nearly lost in the fog. You look tired." He had dropped her hands, and he caught them again with the impulsive frankness of a man who knows himself to be but a poor dissembler. "I am tired, Barbe, heart-tired. I cannot pretend that I am not." "John!" Her voice had a touch of appeal in it. "This morning I went out innocently enough, child, but I have returned with more than I foreshadowed." "Where have you been, John?" "To Thorn." "Thorn!" "Yes." She hung back a little from him, reading the forethought and trouble in his eyes, and the tired yet generous calm of a man thinking of others rather than himself. "You are troubled, John. Tell me." He looked down at her reflectively, and his eyes seemed to say, "Shall I, or shall I not?" Woman-wise, she appeared to understand. "You are afraid for my sake, John." "A little." "Is it because you cannot trust me?" Her eyes held his, and for once it was as though she had the greater power of will. "No, because I wish worry and care away." "John, do you think I shall leave all the burden of life to your shoulders? Are we so little to each other? Am I so selfish?" She felt his hands tighten on hers. "Barbe, I have found my father." "At Thorn?" "Yes." She shuddered slightly, despite herself, and he saw her eyes darken. "John, did you speak to him?" "Without mercy." "Does he know?" "He thinks you are dead." "Why is he at Thorn?" "Hiding from the law because of this plot. Hiding from us, a miserable wreck of a man, half starved, almost mad." She saw his face grow haggard and stern, the lines deepening about the mouth, his eyes staring fixedly at the fire, as though he were looking upon a thing that revolted him. The instinct in her was one of a strong, pure passion to be of use. He had feared for her courage, perhaps for her magnanimity. Yet it was she who took the torch that evening, and carried it so that the darkness seemed less dark. "John, my heart, tell me everything." She drew him by the hands into the inner room, and shut the world out save that world at Thorn. He looked down at her, as though wondering at the will in her, and feeling a strength and courage near him that might have the power of turning destiny into providence. She was calm, yet infinitely vital, and her face had a radiance that drove scorn and bitterness and malice into the dark. He beheld a transfiguration, love bending toward love, beautiful with the beauty of sacrifice, pity, and desire. "John, do you fear for me?" He opened his arms, but paused with a sudden awe of her, and, bowing himself, touched her hands. "No, not now." "Then tell me everything." And he told her, sitting in the firelight, with his hands clasped upon his knees. Silence held them a while in thrall. Barbara was leaning against the jamb of the chimney, one hand laid along her cheek, her eyes full of the past. It was as though some sharp struggle were passing within her, and for a moment her eyes had a glitter of anger. But the gleam passed from them, and her mouth softened. She looked down at the man with a mystery of a smile with no mirth in it, but full of sadness, yearning, and self-reproach. "John," he started, almost as though he had forgotten her, "do you love your father?" The question seemed to stagger him. He frowned at the fire. "Love that!" She rested her head upon her arm. His scorn had made the heart leap in her. "I did, John, my father. And then, what misery, what greater shame!" "But you, John, John, what must it be to lose everything, even the love of one's own son? That touches me even to the heart. Is it not strange that I should feel that even more than you?" He looked at her questioningly, mutely. She had not seen what he had seen: cowardice, squalor, bestial fawning that was infamous in a man, and yet her words woke a depth of feeling in him, something finer and more delicate than this man's nature had fashioned of itself. He opened his mouth to tell her more of the gross truth, but some impulse rebuked him. He waited instinctively for her. Barbara had raised her head. For a moment she stared at the fire, and then turned to him with a look he would never forget. "John, it may help you if I tell you what is in my heart." "Child!" "It is this, John. I can forgive. Yes, I can forgive." He looked at her wonderingly, and then sprang up, opening his arms. She went to him with a low, inarticulate cry, and let him hold her to him, while a great tremor passed through her, as though the old self were vanishing with a last spasm of pain and bitterness. "Barbe, you can forgive?" "Yes." "But is it for my sake?" She raised her head, and her eyes were full of tears. "Yes, partly. You have changed me. And yet it is of my own will." He bent and kissed her lips. "Child, you make me ashamed. It is you that shall teach me. God keep you." CHAPTER 47.